This is Saturday Agenda.
Welcome to Saturday Agenda. I'm Chris Kenny. It's good to be back. It's been a very sad week, I think, in politics this week. No winners have come out of it, and really it doesn't augur well for the year ahead. We had a shambolic political year in Australia last year, and the portents aren't particularly good for this year either. Later in the program, we'll cross to Canberra, where we'll have a political panel of the political editor of the Sunday Telegraph, Samantha Maiden, and also the Australian's reporter Lanny Vasek, who has been at the protests that have enveloped the capital this week. But more importantly, today we're fortunate to be joined as our first guest for the year by the Opposition Leader Tony Abbott, who of course has been at the centre of events this week and will also be critical in how the political year pans out. Thanks for joining us, Mr Abbott.
Chris, nice to be with you.
Tony, we had very ugly scenes in Canberra this week. You're in the middle of that threatened violence on Australia Day. We had the flag burned yesterday. You've been verbaled and people have tried to blame this on you. We now know, of course, that this was in part at least triggered by an intervention out of the Prime Minister's office by one of her staffers. Do you believe that the Prime Minister herself bears any responsibility for this?
Well, Chris, let's not underestimate the seriousness of what happened on Australia Day. We had about 100 people, including our nation's top leaders, trapped inside a very insecure building, and it now seems that this was at least in part triggered by a member of the Prime Minister's own staff. Now, the Prime Minister can't spin her way out of this. She owes the nation a full explanation. Exactly what did her staffer say, exactly to whom did her staffer say it, and who instructed the staffer to say what he did. She really owes us a full explanation. She owes it to everyone in the room. She owes it to the police. She owes it to her own protection detail. This is a very, very serious situation.
You're not suggesting at all, are you, that the Prime Minister would have been aware of this? She would have sanctioned this?
Well, I think, Chris, she has to give us a full explanation because this is probably the most serious security incident to befall our nation's leaders for quite a few years. And in part, at least, it was triggered by the Prime Minister's own office. In part, at least, it seems that a member of the Prime Minister's senior staff was trying to trigger something potentially dire for political advantage.
Now, we've seen the pictures. You were close with the Prime Minister in that situation. You discussed the situation with her. You would have had a sense of how she felt about it. She would have felt vulnerable. I thought she appeared calm and generous in the way she dealt with it. Was that your reading of her situation, that it surprised her and she acted admirably?
Look, I have nothing but praise for the way the Prime Minister and her security detail handled the situation. The situation should never have arisen. It should never have arisen. Information was fed to the crowd at the Tent Embassy, which was false. Trouble was triggered, and it seems that someone from the Prime Minister's office had a very big hand in all of that.
Well, yes, let's get into that in a bit more detail. This Tony Hodges, the media advisor, has resigned over this. The suggestion from the Prime Minister's office was that he just passed on some information about your location. Now, given what we know about the way you were verbaled, people are out there saying you wanted the embassy torn down and dismantled. Surely we are entitled to expect that he may have passed on that information. That apparently has not been denied as yet.
Well, that's right, Chris. This is why the Prime Minister has to front the cameras and give a full and complete explanation. What did he say, precisely? To whom did he say it, precisely? Why did he say it, precisely? And what instructions, if any, was he under, precisely? I mean, this is too important for the PM and her office to just spin it away. I'm sure there are decent people in the Prime Minister's office, but it looks like a pretty grubby business, I've got to say. It really does. It looks like a really poor attempt to turn something to political advantage.
Your frontbench colleague Christopher Pyne has called for a police investigation. What possible police matters could be involved here? I wouldn't have thought that passing on information could possibly be a criminal offence.
Well, plainly, Chris, what happened was a serious security breach. I suspect that a number of offences would have been committed. I think that when you've got a serious security breach involving our nation's leaders, yes, it does have to be fully investigated, and obviously what triggered it has to be fully investigated, and whether the whole thing was triggered by the Prime Minister's office, perhaps to gain some kind of political advantage, well, that needs to be fully investigated by the police.
Look, it's going to go down as a very, very sad Australia Day. Australia Day, I think after a decade of great progress on reconciliation, we've seen these racial fissures open up. We saw yesterday on the steps of Parliament House, or at the front of Parliament House, the flag burned and spat on, children involved. Should it be illegal to burn the flag in Australia?
Well, strictly speaking, Chris, it almost certainly is illegal, unless you were burning it in an authorised fireplace.
People have often called for specific legislation to make it illegal to burn our flag.
Well, I don't think it should ever be done. I think the flag should be treated with respect, but the only place in New South Wales where it's legal to light a fire is a properly constructed fireplace.
OK, now what about the broader issue here of reconciliation? Do you fear that reconciliation has been set back this week, no matter how unrepresentative the protesters might be?
I think the important thing to acknowledge, Chris, is that they are hugely unrepresentative of Aboriginal Australia. I think people like Warren Mundine, Noel Pearson, Sue Gordon, Mick Gooder. I don't always agree with Mick Gooder, but he spoke with common sense about all of this today and during the week. I think these are the authentic voices of Aboriginal Australia, not the people doing the wrong thing and carrying on the way they did outside of Parliament House yesterday.
Well, this has come only days after the federal government received the expert panel's report on the referendum for constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians. Now, I think that was going to be a long shot given what they've recommended anyway, unless the government pares back what they've recommended. Do you think that these incidents this week have significantly retarded the efforts to get this constitutional recognition?
I think it would be a great pity if they did. It would be a great pity if they did. Look, let us consider the issue of constitutional recognition on its merits. I have some concerns about the recommendations of the committee, but I do think it is important to strive towards constitutional recognition. John Howard promoted this at the 2007 campaign. The former coalition government actually put a proposal recognising Indigenous people in the preamble to a referendum in 1999. I think this is an important cause, and let's persevere with it.
You think you can sit down with Julia Gillard and come up with a compromise, perhaps more minimalist approach to get this recognition at the next election?
Well, I'm happy to look carefully at the recommendations of the committee and come up with an appropriate response, and that's what we'll be doing in the weeks ahead. But really, the first thing that the Prime Minister needs to be doing right now is giving us a full explanation of exactly what her staffer was doing yesterday, because what happened yesterday is yet another sign of a incompetent and untrustworthy government, a directionless and divided government, a government where there are no adults in charge. That's the look that we get from this government. Just the last week or so we've had the Andrew Wilkie betrayal. We've had the ongoing Craig Thompson saga.
I just wanted to get you on the Craig Thompson saga. It's been 3 years, this Fair Work Australia investigation. We're still waiting till March before we get a result. Is there anything that can be done to bring this to a head? I mean, most Australians would think that 3 years is enough to investigate the allegations here.
You're absolutely right. The Woodrow Commission into the New South Wales Police Force took less than 3 years. The Fitzgerald inquiry into Queensland corruption took just over 2 years. The Coal Commission into the building industry took just 18 months. This has now gone on for more than 3 years, and by the time it concludes, if it ever concludes, it'll be 3.5 years. This looks like an institutional go-slow to protect the Gillard government. The Gillard government depends absolutely on Craig Thompson's vote in the Parliament. An adverse finding, a criminal charge, could well trigger a by-election. It should trigger a by-election in his seat, and I think that a lot of people are saying who is protecting whom here.
Well, you were criticised for being Dr. No last year and pushing all year to try and force an election because of the precarious parliamentary situation. We now still have that precarious parliamentary situation. In the year ahead, are we going to see a kinder, gentler Tony Abbott with more policy, or are you still intent on forcing an election whenever you can?
I'm intent, Chris, on giving Australia a better government. And the job of the opposition is to expose the flaws in the existing government and to try to become the government itself as soon as possible. So you'll see me doing my job this year as you saw me doing my job last year.
Well, if you had a 2-year plan and you weren't pushing for an early election, people might cut you some slack in terms of policies and costings. But given that you are virtually demanding an election as soon as you can get it, aren't you obliged to get more policy out there on the table and to certainly come up with some costings? You're promising enormous budget savings and we know nothing about them.
And Chris, we will have all of our policies out there in good time before an election.
Well, if you want an election pretty much whenever you can get it, are you telling me all your policy work is done and is in the top drawer?
I'm telling you, Chris, that if the Prime Minister were to call an election tomorrow, we are in good shape to fight it. And we are in great shape to give the Australian people clear plans for the future of our country. We want our country, we want our people to have hope, reward and opportunity, and we've got the plans to deliver that.
The carbon tax comes into force this year. If the Gillard government's carbon tax can reduce Australia's carbon emissions from 5% on the 2000 levels I think it's based on, what will that do for the planet, for the environment, the global environment?
Well, I think it's important to get emissions down, but far more important than anything else at the moment is an extremely fragile international economic situation.
Sure, but what will a 5% cut in emissions in Australia do for the global environment?
I know what you're driving at, Chris. A 5%,
That's a straightforward question. Will it help the planet or not?
A 5% cut in Australia alone will do very little. Still, it is important to do our bit.
Is it worth the billions of dollars that you want to spend on it?
Well, the point I'm trying to make is that now is the worst possible time to introduce the world's biggest carbon tax. Now, I think we should be prepared to invest intelligently in a better environment, and all of the measures that we're proposing under our emissions reduction fund, more trees, better soils, smarter technology, more energy saving, they make sense regardless. They are good things to do. They will also bring our emissions down quite considerably.
There is so much to talk about for the year ahead, but we are running out of time. So I just thought I'd finish up by talking to you about your team. If you're ready for government, you want to have your best team in place. Now, I don't think any fair-minded observer would say that your current frontbench team is the best possible team. When will you update it? Before the election? Will you rule out updating it, upgrading it before the election, having a reshuffle? Or we'll have to wait until after an election to see what your best team is? Well,
I think it is the best team, Chris.
So Arthur Sinodinos is not in your best team?
Look, Arthur Sinodinos is the newest member of the Federal Parliament.
Sure,
he is an outstanding individual. He is chairing the Coalition's deregulation task force, and this is going to be a very important part of our positive policies to take costs off business, small business in particular. Paul Fletcher, I announced it yesterday, is chairing a working group on online safety. Jamie Briggs is the chairman of our Waste Watch Committee and has been doing terrific work exposing the waste in government. I am very pleased that I've got young and not so young, very capable and talented backbenchers who are keeping my front benches on their toes.
But also your front benches...
But it is a good team. It is a very good team.
Your front benches must know that should you win an election, some of those people would come onto the front bench. You couldn't seriously contend that Arthur Sinodinos, for instance, Paul Fletcher, Kelly O'Dwyer, some of these people would be left lamenting on the back bench.
And Kelly is Arthur's deputy on the deregulation task force. Look, all of these people are future front benches. There's no doubt about that. But my existing front bench is doing a very good job, and I expect to take my existing front bench to the election.
All right, I promise this will be the last topic. Peter Slipper, elected by his electorate as a Liberal National Party MP, has turned his back on them, changed sides, become an independent. Unforgivable, really, in an electoral sense, in my view. I think the same argument can be made to a lesser degree of the Conservative independents Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott. We've seen Andrew Wilkie sort of playing games from the government and being left short. Will you rule out forming a government with any of these independents? You have criticised their actions. In some ways they speak for themselves. Surely you couldn't expect your supporters on the Conservative side of politics to rely on any of these people to form another precarious minority government.
Well, one of the reasons why I think Australia needs an election, and needs it now, is because minority government is an experiment that's failed. Clearly, this is the worst government in memory. Worse than Whitlam, incompetent, untrustworthy, divided, directionless. I think a lot of that is the personality and the character of the people at the top of the government, but I think some of it at least is a function of minority government, and that's why I think we need an election.
All right, well, thanks for joining us today, Tony Abbott.
Thanks, Chris.
Appreciate it, and hope we might see you on the program again later in the year. So we'll go to a break now, and when we come back, we'll cross to Canberra to get an insider's view of the political developments and, of course, those ugly protests in the nation's capital.